Hello, and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting part 32 of an exciting new series. What if Villain Deku became a teacher at U.A? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Bloomer Bill on Fanfiction.net. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now let's dive into the story. Sophia opened her eyes blearily and blinked them a few times before she woke up fully. Her eyes taking in the simple room around her, she considered was finally settling down now in the dormitory. It was a nice enough place, and she wasn't surprised that Japan had buildings for international students. They weren't that uncommon in countries with good education systems. And UA, being one of the top hero schools in the world, meant international students like her weren't uncommon. But it being so, nice for lack of a better word. She even got to stay in a room all on her own, and most of the machines in the laundry room worked to boot. UA was probably one of the backers given it was so close to the school. A half-hour walk wasn't that bad compared to her middle school one, and that was probably why it was in such good shape. Sophia rose from her bed and stretched herself out, a couple pops from her back as she did, then moved to grab her uniform, making sure to have everything before marching out of her room to the community bathrooms. Passing a few girls on her way, most of them talking in their own language with each other, the group being a bunch of older girls from France here for university. She tried not to let her ears waver during that time, or look directly at them as she went. She didn't know a word of French, but it wasn't strong to understand the cooing they did or the petting. Sophia was used to being found cute, came with the territory of looking like a cat girl, and she didn't mind it most of the time, especially since she had a way to make the real bold ones back off. But God, did it get tiring being the cute one. Of course, being cute was better than other things she could be in their eyes. But not by much, and only if she kept her mouth shut. There was a reason she waited for the bathrooms to be completely empty before brushing her teeth. Sophia's fur was thick enough to cover the seams of her mouth, but she doubted that a language barrier would keep people from being scared by what her mouth really looked like. You just needed a working pair of eyes to see all of the overlapping rows of teeth within her maw. Something entirely unique to her, as neither of her parents had anything like it. Mom with a cat quirk, and sure, her dad had the teeth of a shark, and they both grow their teeth back when lost, but her dad only had one row of teeth like any other human. Her mom wasn't even a half-half mutant, so her being a full mutation with a mouth like hers and sound factor to boot. Yes, she was quite the curveball when she was born. Thank God her parents were the kind that rolled with the punches, and were willing to send her to UA to train to be a hero. Japan was a more court-friendly place to get a license and schools that were better suited for her training. Sure, Russia had some nice schools, but the ones that would fit her needs would lead her to living with a very specific career path that wouldn't be easy to walk away from, one she never wanted, and her parents had worked very strong to get her this chance. UA had some nice scholarships, and she was given one, but her parents were still helping to pay for some of her things, and so she could get better food for herself than just the basics. Which was nice, though. She wished that she could find something that would work as shoes for her feet. Unfortunately, the mutation shops didn't have anything that would fit her feet here in Japan either. At least she didn't have to deal with nearly as much snow like from where she lived in the mountains then in this part of Japan. Leaving the building, she moved to start walking towards UA, her tail swaying behind her. She was incredibly lucky that there were older girls also going to UA, or she would have never found the building. She had tried to learn some Japanese, but she hadn't had a hope to read it, and the signs were so strong to figure out without context. And it wasn't like she could ask anyone for directions, opening her mouth like that in public. Yeah, no, she did not need that kind of attention while trying to find her way to the school. Mentally, Sophia sighed and let her ears fold back at the thought. She wished she had such a luxury with her classmates, but that QAD test thing meant any hope of just being the cute, quiet cat girl in the back of the class was all but squashed. The only saving grace was that she wasn't called to answer questions and be forced to remind everyone just what her mouth looked like. Not that she could blame them for being afraid of it. The only time she had seen anything that looked close to her mouth was from horror movie clips kids from her middle school often shared with everyone. Hearing the familiar voices of some of her year mates, Sophia slowed down and shook her head to focus on where she was. She was at a disadvantage, enough not understanding what almost everyone else was saying, and didn't need to be lost in her own head on top of it. Walking through the gate, Sophia made sure to keep away from anyone that looks like her classmates to keep from seeing them look at her. They weren't saying anything about her as far as she knew, and she didn't think they were against her. but she saw how they looked at her. Most of them couldn't look at her without staring at where her mouth was. Again, she couldn't blame them with her mouth being what it was, but she'd still like to avoid it for both parties' sake. Sophia moved through the halls. She couldn't help thinking that she was still quite lucky to have been able to attend such a nice school. It was an incredible building, and she had never been in a place so fancy as this one. There were even plenty of outdoor areas for her to eat, so she didn't have to eat with everyone else in the cafeteria, and she didn't have to run into anyone either since there were a lot of courts to eat at. She easily found her way to Class 1A and settled in her seat, glad to be there first like always. Pulling out her books to continue her studies, very glad she didn't need to translate everything into Japanese since they had a couple of translators. As time went on, the rest of class arrived, and she went through the motions while trying her best to follow along with her limited Japanese. Until English, she had a much easier time with that one since her mother was a translator for a company, and she grew up around it. However, she was greatly thankful for Bullet Sensei's T.A. Deku since he had been slipping her what the class topics were for each PRD during homeroom, so she could at least look at her books to somewhat follow along with everyone else when Deku wasn't around to translate directly for her. And the teachers never said anything about it, so she assumed it was an accepted learning aid for her, just like how her homework was in Russian and given to her at the end of the day with a more in-depth explanation on what her homework was. Then once lunch rolled around, she packed up to go to her spot outside and quickly looked around before she took out her lunch and began to eat the mice she chose to have today, only to freeze when she heard the snap of a twig not too far from her and whipped her head around. Deku was standing there and raised his hands in nervous surrender. Sorry for surprising you, Gromova Volkova. One of your classmates noticed you left this behind, Deku told her, showing one of her books. Sophia's ears immediately folded back, and she shut her mouth and signed asterisk its fine DKU. Thank you for going out of your way to bring it for me. Asterisk Deku smiled at her. It's no problem. Gromova Volkova, I've been meaning to ask you something, but didn't want to bother you. Deku informed her as he set the book down on the table. Sophia was hesitant, unsure what he could want to ask her, but ultimately signed that it would be okay. Thank you. You don't have to answer, but I was wondering why you weren't listed as having a Flurkin mutation. Deku inquired, and Sophia blinked, taken aback. A Flurkin? Did she hear him right? Or was Deku not translating correctly, and there wasn't a Russian word for what he wanted to say? Because she had never heard the word before, and certainly had no clue whatever a Flurkin was. Before she could ask, Deku spoke up, likely having noticed her confusion. Sorry. A Flurkin is from an old pre-court comic in the US. It's an alien that looks exactly like a cat, but its mouth opens wider than the dimensions of the jaw like your mouth can. I mean, you don't have the tentacles or nested mouths, but it's mostly the same. Deku explained. Sophia couldn't help being surprised, having never even heard of something like that. While she was still shocked, Deku pulled out his phone and showed her a picture on it of a cat with a mouth that, admittedly, looked kind of like hers. The big difference, barring the tentacle mouth things, being that her mouth split away in 4 directions compared to how everyone else's lower jaw went up and down. It doesn't have any sound power either, but there's another alien from a PQ show that's wolf-like that does. Here's a clip of it. Deku commented before bringing up a cartoonish wolf person, and Sophia audibly gasped when their mouth really did open like hers to howl. The inside didn't have the rows of teeth, but she had never seen anything that looked like her mouth that wasn't depicted purely from a horror perspective. Want me to forward some clips to you, Gromova Volkova? Deku asked, and she nodded rapidly. No problem. I can write down the archive site for you and the search term so you can find it. Deku said, quickly jotting down a note for her, and she greedily took it while grinning. Also, if you consider changing your quirk's name, I can help you with the process as a licensed counselor. Deku added with a simple smile. I'll think about it. Asterisk Sophia signed in reply to him after a few moments, and Deku gave a nod, of course. You wouldn't be the first person who'd want to keep the friendlier version of their quirk. Deku assured calmly before giving her a bow and a wave before leaving. Given she still had another 10 minutes, she searched up the site and saved it before continuing to eat her lunch, feeling much more excited for the end of the school day so that she could search up the show. Sophia had a spring in her step as she returned to the dormitory and rushed up to her room. She didn't bother to change before bringing up the site and searched up the show by name to watch it. Deku had written the wolf alien wouldn't show up until later in the show, and that she could skip to the appearance episode of the wolf alien if she wanted. Sophia had to mull over it for a bit. Part of her wanted to skip straight to the character or to watch up to it so that she had proper context for the show. She saw in the summary it was an American kids cartoon based on a kid turning into aliens and the shenanigans that would ensue from such a thing. She could also watch the show in Russian if she wanted, but she was tempted to watch it in English as it was because she knew enough to follow along. Eventually, she made her choice and decided that she wanted to understand everything that was going on and selected the first episode before flipping a coin for the language she'd watch it in. Then she settled in for a series binge, planning to skip to the wolf alien if she couldn't stand the characters once she started watching. Masaro released a soft exhale as he got off the bus and stood at a rival dojo, his tail swaying languidly behind him as he stared at the smaller and more worn building. An arm wrapping around his neck would have made Masaro jolt in almost any other circumstance, but frankly he was far too aware of his fellow judoka's actions to react with anything other than annoyance. "Oh, don't look so glum. They might have paired you up with a rookie, but we'll still get to add another win to our score," the guy said before he left to go ahead inside, and Masaro couldn't help scowling at the boy. Judo wasn't his favorite of the martial arts. He didn't mind its rules or techniques, but recently the dojo he worked at was just getting worse since the previous sensei retired and gave the dojo over to another sensei. Looking back, over his shoulder, Masaro's tail flicked from his annoyance with the blonde man who was chatting up the other sensei. He was certain that the two were probably going to be good pals with how they were laughing. Turning away from them, Masaro walked over to the dojo's doors and entered the building. Masaro had to admit the way things were set up wasn't that bad, but he still wasn't all that happy to be here, especially when he caught sight of the fight rooster and was reminded of his fight. Masaro was a green belt now, and he should have been paired up with someone of the same rank or of his age in the level above or below him if there wasn't enough in his belt rank. Instead, he'd been paired with someone with a yellow belt, which made him feel slighted. In almost any other circumstance, this wouldn't happen, but the new sensei was clearly not a fan of mutation quirks like his own, and was why he was given an opponent beneath his level and closer the rank his dojo's new sensei believed he was. Fortunately, his new sensei couldn't change his rank, so he could keep the belt he earned, but he was certain that he wouldn't be able to rank up anymore with how the man treated him. The few other mutation quirk kids he knew had already dropped out of the dojo or went elsewhere soon after the new sensei took over. Masaro hadn't out of loyalty to the old sensei, but frankly if things like this continued to happen he'd probably drop out as well. Getting a green belt was fine, and if he wanted to take it up again, he could later when he found another decent dojo. Looking around, he wasn't surprised to see that almost everyone in the dojo in uniform probably had emitter quirks from the lack of quirk features on them. But then he blinked surprised when he noticed a tall guy in the bleachers that had a clear mutation. Masaro started walking over to the guy, fully intending to ask him if he knew someone at the dojo, but stopped just short as anxiety welled up in him at the thought of speaking with the man. He had a mutation quirk, sure, but that didn't mean he'd be nice to Masaro. The guy's mutation was clearly a stronger one than his own, and he had some difficult experiences with other kids that were full mutations. He did just have a tail after all. Masaro liked his tail. It was much stronger than some of the cutesy ones, but it didn't have more than that to it. So despite having a mutation quirk, he hadn't really fit in with the kids with mutation quirks with how normal he looked. And with his large tail, he didn't really have a place with anyone else. So his social circle was smaller than most kids could have, but it let him focus on martial arts. It wasn't like he didn't have any friends, he just hadn't met any of them in person since they were his gaming friends. But he chatted with them more recently to vent about the new sensei, and having them get angry on his behalf was nice even if CC's jokes about tracking the sensei down didn't always land. At least Green was there with some advice for dealing with things. While Masaro was lost and thought the guy must have noticed him and had moved to be closer to him, and Masaro jumped realizing how caught up in himself he had to have been to miss the guy getting so close. Masaro gulped and nervously gave a bow to the guy. "Hello, I'm Ojiro," he managed to greet the man. The guy nodded his head. "I'm Shoji. I guess you're from the other dojo, right? My friend said they were having a tournament with another one today." Shoji asked, sitting back down, and Masaro hesitantly joined him. "Yeah, has your friend been going here long?" Masaro politely inquired since the guy brought up his friend up first. Shoji shrugged. "I don't know. He joined around July last year, so maybe 10 months. Is 10 months a long time to practice judo?" Shoji questioned, clearly not well-versed in martial arts himself, from what Masaro could tell. Masaro didn't blame him for that, though. Even with Mac mixed animal combat rising in popularity, it wasn't all that common just yet in Japan, and most dojos wouldn't take on someone with 6 arms outside of Mac once. Well, it's not that long, admittedly, but most people don't stick around for a year unless they're dedicated to learning it. Masaro answered, being honest, and he did believe that Shoji's friend likely had a mutation quirk as well, and if they managed to stick it out in a dojo like this, then Masaro had to give them props for it. Suddenly, he wasn't so sure his matchup was as unfair as he might have thought it was. If this dojo-sensei was like the new one it is, then Shoji's friend might have been just held back like himself. And that was why they only had a yellow belt instead of orange, and therefore a perfectly valid person for him to fight. Masaro was about to ask about this when a shout from across the room made him stop. "Oi, Gigi," and Masaro turned to face the source of the shout and saw a guy in a sleeveless GI with a bandana grinning at the two of them. The guy rushed over to them. "What the hell are you doing all the way back there, Gigi? Don't want to block everyone's view." The guy questioned, still grinning and directing his attention at Shoji. Masaro frowned at the insult and was about to speak up for the guy next to him. He hadn't known Shoji long, but he was nice enough to him despite his mutation being not as pronounced as the older man's. "Yeah," Shoji answered calmly, cutting him off, and for some reason completely fine with the insult to Masaro's bafflement. The boy gave an amused huff, then turned to him. "Who's this Gigi? Did you make a new friend?" The boy asked, not that unkindly, admittedly. "This is Ojiro. He's from the other dojo. This is my friend Yosetsu," Shoji explained, gesturing to the two of them respectfully as he introduced them to each other. Yosetsu beamed at him and bowed to him. "Great to meet you, Ojiro. I've been looking forward to my fight with you," Yosetsu said, and Masaro fumbled a bit, unsure how he should respond to the guy. He seemed to be genuine, and he felt somewhat embarrassed for assuming things about Yosetsu. Before he could string a sentence together, though, Yosetsu's eyes clocked his belt, and his eyes went wide for some reason, and he turned to Shoji. "Hey, what color is Ojiro's belt, Gigi?" Yosetsu asked, causing Shoji to blink. "Green," Shoji answered, confused, shocking Yosetsu. "What? But I'm a yellow belt. Ojiro should be fighting someone like Honda, or something, not me," Yosetsu exclaimed, and Masaro felt a bit off about it. How could he have not known they weren't the same rank when the fighters' names were the same color as their rank? Yosetsu suddenly turned bashful and rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding his eyes, and Masaro cursed himself and ducked his head too when he realized he said the question out loud. "I'm kind of colorblind. I can't see some colors like red. And green and yellow are the same color for me. What did the docs call it? I got protanopia colorblindness. I think that's the one," Yosetsu answered. "And I noticed our belts had different designs and wasn't sure if your dojo just has different ones for the same color or, well, you know." Yosetsu further elaborated for him, awkwardly saying it, though Masaro knew what he meant since the ranks of junior belts had the white part in different designs. Well, now that made Masaro feel bad, and he held up his hands. "It's not that bad. I was just surprised you didn't know," Masaro told the boy. Yosetsu relaxed some and chuckled a little bit. "Now I understand. Color blindness ain't that common, but why would they pair us up in the first place?" Yosetsu replied, looking lost at the situation in general. Masaro hesitated, mainly because after he shared a look with Shoji, it seemed that Yosetsu was the only one who didn't suspect the reason. But after a moment, he let his shoulders slump. "Well, my sensei isn't quite trained to teach mutant quirk people," Masaro said, struggling to find a way to say it without being disrespectful to his new sensei. Yosetsu, however, clearly read between the lines, and he sked, grumbling something under his breath about as he crossed his arms. "Okay, so your sensei is a PP. But why would my sensei?" Yosetsu trailed off as the realization slowly connected in his head. Yosetsu's head snapped to Shoji. "You aren't sitting back here because you don't want to block anyone's view, are you?" Yosetsu questioned, and Shoji blatantly avoided Yosetsu's eyes. "Gigi," Yosetsu said, getting much more seriously, "has my dojo been giving you SHD for your quirk?" Yosetsu pressed, and Shoji ducked his head, looking somewhat ashamed of the fact, his silence speaking volumes for both of them. Yosetsu became incredibly angry, and for a second Masaro thought the boy was about to storm over to the dojo senseis and curse them both out for their quirkism. but Yosetsu didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath, and though he was still scowling and crossed his arms, then chose to cryptically say, "I'm telling Zuri." Shoji jolted at that, and immediately said, "That is not necessary, Awakuen," looking somewhat distressed by the idea, but Yosetsu was firm in his resolve. "I'm telling him," Yosetsu said back, and Shoji tried once again to convince him not to tell this mysterious Zuri, but Yosetsu snapped back, "I am telling him," with steel in his eyes, and Shoji slumped defeated. Yosetsu sighed, "Look, Gigi, if it was the other way around and people were giving me SHD for my Korkyu, and Yukai wouldn't hesitate to sick Zuri on them. And we'd all go apeshit if someone did that to Yukai. That protective CRP goes for you too, Gigi," Yosetsu told Shoji. Shoji bashfully ducked his head and covered his face with one of his hands to hide the part of his face mask didn't. "I know," Shoji admitted. "Oh, don't be like that, Gigi. You're the kid of our group, so we're going to be the most protective of you," Yosetsu teasingly said with a light hit to one of Shoji's arms, and the taller boy blushed more. "Kid?" Masaro repeated, surprised. Yosetsu hummed, "Yeah. Gigi here turned 15 last February, so he's the baby of our group," Yosetsu told him jokingly as he elbowed Shoji, who hissed Yosetsu's name, clearly embarrassed, while Masaro was stunned and tried to understand how he was older than the near 6-foot boy next to him. "Hey, Ojiro," Yosetsu said, getting his attention, "I know you'll probably kick but when we fight later, but until then do. You think you can help me with my form? I suddenly don't have a lot of faith in the asshat being a good teacher now that I know he's a Quercus Beach," Yosetsu asked, head tilted to the side. Masaro's mouth opened, and he felt a bit flustered at being asked to help the other boy, so plainly saying that he'd be the better teacher, even if he was quite a bit crude about it. But he ultimately nodded, agreeing, and got a big grin from the boy in return. "Thanks, Ojiro. Come on, let's go over to the mat, it's over here," Yosetsu said, taking Ojiro by the arm, and began tugging him over to where the mats were set up for light sparring. Dobby wondered if he died in his 50s meant that he could count this as a midlife crisis, because it sure felt like one when he was spending his day off walking through a shrine to find his place in it while disguised. As much as it pained him to admit the Took was right about him being too easy to recognize with just dyeing his hair a different color, anyone with half a brain that saw him use his quirk would put two and two together. A thing he'd much preferred didn't happen, thank you very much. Which of course begged the question, if he wanted so desperately to remain hidden, why in the hell was he going to the very large and public shrine where his remains supposedly were and risk being caught in the first place? Frankly, Dobby didn't have any clue either, and the leading reason in his mind was that exposure to his family had finally nuked his brain to a pile of mush, and that the Took blended it up before pouring it back into his head. Because this was 100% the Took's fault, and no one could tell him otherwise. When he'd agreed to meet up with his uncle, he didn't think it would change much. The slushy was dense, but not a complete, but troubled by his past, and had family baggage to boot. Just one in a million, really, but he was willing to indulge himself for a little while, since the worm promised to give him a bonus for each meeting. And it wasn't like the man was some try-strong trying to force him to be family or anything. However, after the most recent visit, the worm didn't drop him off at home or Red's Bakery afterwards like always, but brought him back to the Took and his clone's hive, as he had taken to naming the windowless office the three worked. The worm hadn't let on while Slushy was there, but he had discovered something that day and wanted to tell him in private because of how Dobby could have reacted to the news, but the worm insisted that he needed to know what he'd learned. Dobby's hands trembled as he remembered the conversation, and his mouth felt much drier as well as he forced the boy's words back before they could once again replay themselves. Dobby kept his head down as he walked, and stiffly walked until he finally made it to his destination, only pausing as fought to raise his head and actually look at his part of the shrine. He had never visited before, and was previously only vaguely aware one existed at all thanks to the massive news coverage his death attracted. Before now, he wasn't quite biting at the chance to see it. And yet here he was, because of the TW case, clone's words no less. Dobby had some idea of what would be in front of him, likely some presents from well-wishers. Maybe something a bit more personal from Fuyumi or Natsuo, since he could only see either of those two coming to see him. An urn full of ash from the fire all those years ago that was probably from the building rather than his. Then there was the thing that made his guts twist to think about, and what was keeping him from raising his head in the first place. There would be a picture of his younger self and a name plate saying, Todoroki Tuya. It was screwed up, something even he had to acknowledge, but he despised being reminded that he was once Tuya. Someone so pathetically weak. It wasn't strong to remember, and if anything it pissed him off how easy it was to retrace his way back to how simple he thought the world was as a child. The memories were blurry, but clear in the intent. Despite being a child, he understood his place in life. It wasn't that strong, to be honest, and Endeavor's whims were completely childish. He, Tuya, was a child born to surpass his father's greatest rival, All Might, and take the spot as #1 hero that rightfully belonged to his father. That he was nothing more than a tool to the man hadn't bothered him. He was the man's son, and as the child he was supposed to listen to his parents and respect them. Of course, there was his mother's wishes to consider, but she wasn't quite as interested in him as she was his younger sister Fuyumi. Tuya didn't quite understand why at the time, but figured that while sons were supposed to follow their fathers, that daughters in turn were supposed to take after their mothers. He wasn't all that invested in figuring out why his mother so clearly preferred his sister back, then since his mother acted like a mother to him and took care of his needs. It wasn't until Fuyumi was 4 that he learned that the way he saw people and his relationships with them was different. They were just their parents' tools after all, and he hadn't seen why being family would mean that much in the grand scheme of things. But Fuyumi always went out of her way to do things that she thought would make him happy or get him to play with her. Tuya had just assumed that Fuyumi was merely overly attached to people since neither of their parents acted so affectionately with him, or anyone else in the family for that matter. Even Mother, with her favoritism of his sister, wasn't nearly as excessive as Fuyumi. But then Natsuo was born and he too was overly attached like Fuyumi. At least the two of them had each other to mess around with and left him to work on his quirk so that he could be a good successor, just as he was always meant to be. Sure, he was civil with them. They were his siblings, and he was expected to be somewhat nice to them, as any good child was supposed to be. But the two of them just seemed to be obsessed with playing around instead of the reason for why they were born. It didn't help that he was losing his edge as the pain from using his quirk increased. He wasn't attached to their family the same way his siblings were, but that didn't mean he hadn't felt no connection to his family either. Endeavor was his father, and he knew he wanted to be a worthy successor. He was his mother's oldest child, and was supposed to make her proud of him, even if she wouldn't look at him fully until his hair started going white from the stress of his quirk. And that as the oldest sibling, he was supposed to be protective of his little sister and brother, who were so childish compared to him, and entertain their silly whims from time to time. Then he was forced to stop by his father and realize that he was no longer the man's tool, but considered his failure. Just like Natsuo was completely useless for not having a quirk to begin with. But unlike with his brother, Tuya had no idea why he was tossed aside. He had a powerful quirk and had always been such a good child for his father and never complained about their training. What had he done wrong? All at once, he was losing his purpose. The one he'd based his whole existence upon now meant nothing, and his bond to his father utterly severed, and himself to be forgotten as his parents tried for another child. Tuya had never loved his father, but the man was the one he was closest to, and to suddenly have everything ripped away from him because he wasn't perfect had created a desperation within him that even he was surprised by to return to the status quo that had always been before now. Because their father was all Tuya had, his mother wouldn't ever look at him like she did Natsuo, much less how she doted on Fuyumi. And his siblings were annoying with how suffocatingly naive and childish they were. He couldn't ever hope to have the same relationship he had with his father with any of them. So Tuya persisted in learning to use his quirk, regardless of the pain, to prove he shouldn't be abandoned. Then Shido was born, and Tuya learned of the venomous coils of envy. It was clear to everyone in their family that Shido would be the masterpiece that their father had desired to create from the very beginning, and none of them could ever take their father's attention from the baby. Tuya had utterly despised the child, the one meant to replace him, and succeeded in doing so from BRTH. And for the first months, Tuya didn't think of Shido as his baby brother, but a damned parasite born to replace him, and whose very existence mocked him for being a failure. This venom pooled until Tuya finally attempted to destroy the parasite, to prove his father wrong, and that he was the only one who could be the man's tool. Tuya hadn't been successful and was locked away in another house without food or water for a month as punishment. something his mother and Fuyumi usually fought, but even they couldn't forgive him for attacking Shudo. Natsuo had been the only one to seek him out and bring him supplies so that he wouldn't die. Tuya was plenty strong enough to get out on his own, even if father had beaten him so badly, and Tuya remembered questioning his brother about why he bothered to do that when he knew what Tuya had done. The answer had changed many things, but mostly Tuya's perception of his brother Natsuo. Natsuo had said he hated that Tuya attacked Shudo, but that he understood that Tuya's brain didn't work like his and Fuyumi's, that Tuya couldn't love them like they loved each other, but that he still cared for them regardless. Natsuo continued to say that he knew that Tuya only hated Shudo because he thought Shudo was replacing him in their family, and that for their father Shudo had, but that for him Tuya would always be their brother no matter what. Natsuo was barely 4, so the boy's wishes for his brother to not leave him when he was the one who, arguably, cared about him the most wasn't surprising, but it was Natsuo's understanding that the two of them were different that made Tuya look at his brother for the first time since he was proven quirkless and swiftly dismissed by their father. Staring down at the boy pleading with him to stay with them, Tuya was forced to acknowledge that he'd been wrong about his understanding of his purpose. He was no longer his father's tool, no matter how much it stung his pride to admit that, but he wasn't just a brother to Natsuo either. He was the boy's world. Fuyumi would always be mother's favorite, and it was clear how much their father hated the boy's mere existence and was already starting to monopolize Shudo's, so that left Natsuo with no one else but Tuya. So Tuya, albeit slowly, changed his focus, something that was helped by Natsuo visiting him in secret and staying the night with him despite knowing what the consequences would be if he were caught, the action reinforcing the new bond being forged between them. When his punishment was up, Tuya returned to the house, and as soon as he spotted Shudo, he didn't find himself entangled in hatred like he used to be when seeing the infant, having grown oddly enough indifferent to the boy during the month, and as he quickly left the room to find Natsuo. Tuya marveled that night as he realized that Natsuo had been correct in that he didn't actually hate his youngest sibling, but their father for tossing him aside, and wondered just how much smarter his brother was. He spent most of his time with Natsuo after that, something he wouldn't have been able to do before their father shifted his focus to Shudo, and eventually it seemed no one but himself remembered what he had done, that or had just forgiven him like Fuyumi certainly did. As the years rolled by, Tuya only became even more consumed with being a good big brother to his siblings. Mainly Natsuo, as Fuyumi hadn't proven to be nearly as smart. Natsuo was by choosing to remain blind and lie to herself about their family. Of course, during this time, the hate that once possessed him instead was rightfully directed at their father, and he began to spite him alongside Natsuo, himself for being tossed aside, and Natsuo for the man being nothing short of awful to them all. And the perfect way to F with the man was to interfere with his training of Shudo. It was killing two birds with one stone, really. Natsuo clearly loved their youngest sibling and wouldn't have the time with Shudo otherwise with how tightly their father reigned Shudo's life. So by taking Shudo away or butting in on the training to mitigate the damage Shudo got would only make Natsuo adore him more. And as a plus, he could F with their old man all he wanted. An unintended side effect of this was the bond that grew between him and Shudo, the baby brother he tried to kill. Shudo, much like Natsuo, looked at him like he was the most important person in the world, and Tuya greedily lapped up all of the boy's attention, deeply enjoying his role as both of his brother's savior. Things only changed again when Shudo was 5, and Tuya learned what it meant to be afraid for another person. He was looking for Shudo as they were playing hide and seek only to hear Shudo crying. The sound oddly tore at him and rushed forward to the kitchen only to find their mother, normally a benevolent woman that hardly mattered in his mind with how little she did for him since he became more independent, standing over Shudo pouring boiling water on his brother. Tuya's exact memory of what he did next were lost to the plunging fear that engulfed him so suddenly. However, by the end of it their mother had been thrown across the room, further losing her mind to madness, as he sat in the furthest corner away from her, clutching Shudo protectively to his chest, and flames wrapped around him like a blanket to keep that woman away from them both. After they'd been found, their mother had been sent away, but Tuya could hardly care about that woman. Whatever she'd once meant to him was nothing compared to the scar on Shudo and the realization that both of his brothers could truly be hurt. Of course, Shudo had been hurt during training, and he'd fixed Natsuo's cuts and scrapes before, but the pain their mother had inflicted upon them was so much worse than anything their father had done to them so far. And in the wake of the terror was a scar that he couldn't fix and left both of them so terribly vulnerable. Something that their father took advantage of, because now they knew their father could permanently remove someone from their lives, and that there was nothing any of them could do. And for the first time, Tuya began to protect his brothers from their father in earnest. Their father was much crueler in his training of Shudo, and without their mother there, he was the only one capable of protecting them. Fuyamai was completely useless in this matter. What with her constant begging him to not cause trouble, as if their father wasn't the one tormenting their brothers, and that their brothers so clearly and desperately needed him to keep them safe. Then came that night almost 9 years ago when Tuya failed for the last time. Tuya was reintroduced to fear that day and never looked back. Something that made Dobby want to spit on the boy's grave for how much of a coward he was, even though he was just as consumed by that very same fear. Because unlike Dobby, Tuya truly was weak. Too weak to be his father's tool. Too weak to protect his brothers. And even too weak to save himself in the end. However, he had managed to survive and become Dobby. Someone selfish, but strong enough to be far more than a pathetic man's dog. Someone who could bring down his BSDRD father in order to ultimately protect his brothers. And now he was someone who would be able to survive the process even if his quirk wasn't the perfect blend like Shudo's. Except now, that might not be true now either from what the worm told him. The worm was recording the two of them using their quirks. Only for this time he caught Dobby on film as well, and because he was using a heat radar, the worm could see the way each of their quirks worked. And the Slushy's quirk worked as expected, but the worm noticed something about his body that didn't align with what they previously knew about his quirk. Apparently, while using his quirk, it made his body heat up like expected, but then it seemed to cool down by drawing in the cold air made from Slushy's quirk hitting his own. Something that hinted at his quirk having a bigger connection to his mother's ice quirk, since he could unconsciously draw in the cold to cool his body, and possibly could do much more than that if he trained his quirk. Which meant that his quirk was more like his baby brother's instead of Endeavor's. Part of him was overjoyed by this fact that he was more connected to Shudo in a way that BSDRD couldn't touch. But a larger part of him was howling with maniacal laughter as anger, sadness, and grief clashed inside of him. It was merciless, and if anyone could hear it would know there wasn't a shred of happiness in it. Because what else he could do when he learned that in every way possible that he wasn't a failure, and that the only reason he hadn't been the masterpiece Endeavor wanted was because the man screwed up on every step on the way. His life could have been so different if that man had a single ounce of decency. Instead here, he was on the verge of a mental breakdown in front of his own grave. Finally, after hours of poring over his memories, Dobby lifted his head and stared at the picture of him. It was from when he was 13, and his hair had fully grown white, a small smile on his younger form's face. The well of disgust Dobby expected when he stared at Tuya didn't come. If anything, his mind, for whatever reason, seemed to calm the raging emotions inside him. God, he had to be F in the head for that to make any sense. But upon finally seeing the grave of Tuya, a wave of, he'd call it, acceptance fell on him and brought about an odd sense of calmness. Thinking back to his words to Slushy, he felt that was probably more accurate than he thought back then. Tuya did die 9 years ago in that fire, and he, Dobby, was born in his stead. With this final thought, Dobby released a long, weary sigh, then walked forward, and his hand reached out to part of the altar where Natsuo had left a keychain for him. It had to be because it was the twin to the one he got for Natsuo when he had his first day of school. Dobby plucked it from the altar and proceeded to walk towards the entrance of the shrine, ready to go home and eat dinner with Red, all the while rubbing his thumb over the keychain. Shoyuta wasn't sure why, but he knew something was going to happen today. Because as awful as the universe was to him, Shoyuta, despite what most of his colleagues would believe, didn't wake up with the ever-looming urge to stab someone's eyes out that often. Even less frequently did he wake up on a Sunday feeling this much bloodlust. And so as he got up from bed, he didn't just throw on his lazy day clothes, and instead headed straight for his shower, letting the cold water wake his butt up fully before getting dressed in one of his business suits. He hated wearing suits, but if the way he woke up was anything to go by, then his coffee-stained t-shirt and pink sweats wouldn't be appropriate for whatever was going to go down today. He proceeded to brew some coffee and go back over the papers he graded yesterday, paying much closer attention to the essays for any details he might have looked over the first time over. This was how Hisashi found him when he woke up, stopping himself mid-stumble to gawk at him, even though he wasn't wearing his glasses, so he wouldn't be able to see him completely clearly. "Are you okay there, Sho?" Hisashi tentatively asked, and Shoyuta only gave him an agitated hum back as he sipped on his coffee. "Great," Hisashi replied, awkwardly stretching out the word as he began to sweat dew. "You have to go in for court today?" Hisashi asked, his eyes locked on their shared calendar, trying very strong to see if he missed an appointment, but his lack of glasses was getting in the way. "No," Shoyuta replied. Hisashi, now more awake, carefully approached Shuta's side, his eyes glancing at the papers before going back to him. "Is everything okay, Sho?" Hisashi questioned, a touch more quiet. Shoyuta pursed his lips and took another drink of his coffee. "I'll tell you when I figure out what's going on." Shoyuta answered after a few moments before he returned his attention to the essays. Hisashi nodded, leaving him alone after that, though he kept an eye on him as he puttered around the apartment getting ready for work, something that was annoying, but Shoyuta couldn't fully blame the blonde for it. Days like this usually went to SHD pretty fast, and the last time Hisashi found him scowling in a suit first thing in the morning, Shoyuta ended up being shot in the gut and out of commission for a week as he recovered. He really hoped today wasn't going to be like that. He didn't think he could possibly take that much time off with everything that was going on at the school. The upcoming sports festival was bad enough, but adding all of the SHD with Midoriya Shouta physically couldn't afford to take any time off, and knowing Nezu, it was highly likely that he'd choose the boy to be his substitute as he recovered. Almost immediately his dour mood soured considerably more at the thought. The boy would absolutely corrupt the others, and he'd be plagued with even more chaotic children to wrangle. He was very much not looking forward to the day Ito-san retired and Midoriya was promoted to a full teacher. Shoyuta was brought out of his thoughts by his student's ringtone, and Shoyuta didn't hesitate to pick up Aizawa. He said perhaps a bit curtly, but he was too on edge that morning to reel himself in. "Hey, Sensei." Shoyuta immediately straightened up upon hearing it was Minetta Oswald on the other end of the phone and realized exactly why he woke up feeling violent this morning. "Are you okay, problem child?" Shoyuta questioned, and the suddenly given nickname made the boy scoff. "Physically, yeah. Mentally, though." Oswald wasn't able to continue his answer as he began laughing again, the near-quiet, spiteful kind that could easily become sobbing at any moment. "Problem child," Shoyuta repeated, very close to breaking another cup in his hand. "Sensei, I know you are my homeroom teacher anymore, but could you get me the hell out of this shithole?" Oswald asked. Shoyuta was on his feet and grabbed his car keys. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Pack a night bag." Shoyuta promised, already out the door, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "I didn't even tell you where I am," Oswald pointed out with another scoff. "I was your homeroom teacher. I know your home address." Shoyuta corrected, and that made Oswald snort, "F stalker." Shoyuta let the last comment slide, since he normally wasn't in the habit of memorizing his students' addresses. "Just be ready to leave when I get there, Brad." He warned the boy, then hung up so he could shoot a quick text to Nezu about what he was doing, mainly to cover his, but against any kidnapping charges. Even with the ward system in place, all things considered, it would be so much easier if he didn't take the kid first and file later. Nezu would be able to open the case before he got there, and it would be rather helpful to have a case number for the police if the family decided to call them on him. Then, as he said, once he got in his car, he was at the Minetta's residence within 10 minutes. A decent-looking 2-story home. Not his style, and he certainly couldn't see the appeal of colors either. Walking up to the door, Shoyuta gave it a decently loud knock and waited for a few moments before he pressed the doorbell. He could kick the door down in this situation, but Shoyuta wasn't that irritated yet. If he still didn't get an answer in 2 minutes, then all bets were off, though. Unfortunately, someone answered the door 30 seconds from the cutoff, and Shoyuta couldn't stop himself from scowling when he saw who answered the door instead of a student. Minetta Aoi, Oswald's stepmother, according to the boy's file. He'd met the woman before at parent-teacher meetings, and she hadn't stuck out much in his mind at the time. Now, however, his opinion of her swiftly nosedived in a few seconds. What kind of person answers the door in what Shoyuta was very hesitant to call a nightgown? "Oh, Shoyuta, what in the world brings you here?" She purred, leaning against the door frame. purposefully crossing her arms in a way to push up and display her ample chest. Choosing to ignore her shamelessness for the moment, Shoyu cut straight to the issue at heart. "I'm here about your stepson, Minetta-san." Shoyu answered plainly and trying to remain professional, but not give away his exact reason. Minetta gave him a dazzling grin and batted her eyes at him. "I'm sorry, Shoyu, but my hubby isn't home right now. He has to leave a lot for work, you know," she told him in mock sadness before she pushed off the door to get closer to him. "Of course, you're more than welcome to come inside and wait for him to get back. I would be happy to keep you entertained while we wait for him." She added one of her hands, coming up to trace a pattern on his arm. But Shoyu swiftly stepped back and couldn't help staring at the woman, because seriously, what the F? Shoyu might not be the best at reading SXL intent, but even he isn't that dense. "For F's sake, I didn't think you could sink any lower, but you keep proving me wrong, you F cow," Oswald hissed, catching both of their attention. Shoyu was relieved to see his student didn't seem to be harmed, and he saw that the boy had followed his instructions since he had a duffel bag in one hand, which meant they could leave much faster than he thought they would. Perks of having hair that could be used as extra arms, Shoyu guessed, as Oswald quickly moved past the two of them and was heading towards Shuta's car. Minetta, however, wasn't nearly as happy. "Oswald, where do you think you're going, and is that any way to talk to your mother?" she exclaimed, clearly more upset at his words rather than being caught trying to stuck her stepson's teacher. Oswald froze and dropped his bag, turning back to glare at Minetta with his hair writhing from what could only be anger. "I am not, nor will I ever be your son," Oswald said, seething before grabbing his bag and storming off to his car. Minetta made to follow the boy, but Shoyu raised his arm, blocking her, and glared when she looked up at him, surprised. "Minetta, I am here to collect your stepson as a ward of UA. If you have any questions, you can call the number on UA's website," he told her. He watched Minetta's mouth open and close, and Shoyu made the executive decision to leave before the woman caught up to what was going on and would start arguing with him. He'd very much wanted to avoid a shouting match on a front lawn with a half-naked woman. He doubted that would ever go down well in any circumstance. His student was already in the car, and Shoyu didn't hesitate to get in and drive off, heading to U. Shoyu glanced over at Oswald once they were at stoplight. The boy was sitting in the passenger seat, arms crossed and glaring at his lap. Shoyu sighed and turned back to the road. "You gonna ask why I called?" Oswald asked after a moment. "You want me to?" Shoyu replied. Oswald was silent for a few more minutes before speaking again. "The nagging beach wanted to adopt me. Showed me the papers and everything." Oswald told him before scoffing. "The only reason she wants to adopt me is because I'm about to be a hero and she wants to ride whatever fame I get. FC?" Oswald said, hissing the last part under his breath, so Shoyu didn't comment on it. "It's bad enough living with that woman, but like hell I'm going to let that woman be my mom. Even if my mom wasn't alive, I'd never let that beach legally tie me to her," Oswald said, and Shoyu could tell his student was very serious about it. Shoyu merely nodded along, completely understanding where the boy was coming from. He could not relate fully, but the bone-deep longing of leaving an awful situation. He would have done something very stupid himself if Hizashi hadn't taken him in during their third year. There was a buzzing noise, and since they came to another traffic light, Shoyu watched from the corner of his eye as Oswald got his phone out, and the boy scowled before tapping at the phone, causing it to stop buzzing. "Your stepmother," Shoyu guessed, and Oswald sked. "Worse, my bio dad. Beach must have called him after we left," Oswald explained, clearly not that bothered by it. Shoyu gave a hum of understanding. "Might want to text anyone you want to tell about becoming a ward," he advised, since things were going fast, and the kid might forget otherwise. "Oh, you're right," Oswald quietly replied, before Shoyu assumed the boy started texting his friends. There was a snort from the pinkette, and Shoyu glanced at the kid, which a student noticed. "Sorry, Miyake and Heido just offered to go over and get anything I left back at the house," Oswald explained to him, and Shoyu nodded. The idea of the pair going over to the boy's house was somewhat entertaining. "Wouldn't let him, though. Miyake could put the little SHD in his place, but I don't want Heido or Heia around him either way. The hell spawn's worse than his mom most of the time," Oswald added after a moment. Shoyu didn't comment on it himself. "We can send someone over to get your things if you don't want to get them in person later," Shoyu told the boy. Oswald was quiet for a few moments, then asked, "Do you think we could get General Sensei to do it?" Shoyuta grinned in response. Having a quirk that gave you the ability to break each idea you're introduced to by every possible factor was both a blessing and a curse. Nezu knew and understood this fact very well. It was why his relationships generally were difficult to maintain outside of a business sense, because often the best course of action for him wasn't the one that would make him friends, which was sad but frankly very necessary. Even now, after many years of work and a reputation as a hero, he was in a precarious position as someone that wasn't human. Nezu had made a lot of political plays to even get where he was now. First by playing as an innocent child the commission could use as mascot hero, then making himself out to be a hyper-intelligent mastermind no one could touch. But at the same time, he couldn't be seen as that threatening, or he'd give the commission reason to remove him from the power he needed to keep himself safe as a person. And for the first time he could possibly remember, Nezu had met someone that was in a position similar to his own, though with noticeable differences. Yes, Izuku was a human, whereas he was an animal. But when one looked at the current laws, it was clear to see that a two-toes had less rights than some protected animals. And Izuku, unlike himself, had many people in his corner, especially compared to himself. However, most of Izuku's people weren't any more his friends than Nezu's students were, even if Izuku had a closer relationship with his students. But that was where the differences ended as far as he was concerned, as both Nezu and Izuku had to face multiple people wanting to, for lack of a better word, dehumanize them for what they were born being. Some of those threats being serious enough to be life-threatening. That their respective reputations were the only thing that kept them each in a somewhat safe place for them. Places that they could be easily taken from by one wrong move and thrown directly into the wolf's den. And it was this last fact that had Nezu ruminating for the past couple of days, because his last conversation with Izuku had him pondering, mainly about Izuku's plan and by taking it apart at every angle to dissect it. And unfortunately, Nezu could only find that Izuku's comment about it being their best option was only becoming more and more true. They had no choice but to kill all for one. Locking him up would only be a temporary fix, if even that, so killing him was the only way to permanently be rid of him, something he knew needed to happen since the man had no qualms about using others as cattle. And that most plans wouldn't be viable because of the numerous quirks he held. Poison immunity could be built up without a quirk and centuries of time to do it. And as Nezu ran through the other options, only bought up dozens of counters, both aided and without help from a quirk. The only way to kill all for one would be by doing something that the man couldn't anticipate, like using a loyal Nomu to kill him with a gun at point-blank range would indeed be the only way to do it without escalating to a full-on war that would kill thousands, if not leave the entire island completely desolate for who knows how long. Of course, just one shot wouldn't be enough, but it would give them the opening they needed while the man's brain was half destroyed to ensure he could not come back, even if he found a healing quirk that would let him survive severe brain trauma. And Kirojiri, quite frankly, was key to this plan working, as teleport quirks weren't common, and all for one would be on alert for any foreign ones. Kirojiri's would on the other hand be unsuspicious, and give them the split second to take the first shot. Kirojiri was basically a unicorn in a pre-quirk world for them. Izuku's plan, on top of minimizing casualties to single-digit numbers, would safely get the most at-risk victims safely away from all for one. However, despite knowing this was the best plan, Nezu couldn't help a welling sense of unease with it. Because the entire plan hinged on Izuku, a person who he was quickly realizing that he was becoming very attached to, staying in an incredibly dangerous position and staying deep in enemy territory. And there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. Tenko was attached to Izuku, and it would be near impossible for them to organically make another relationship even half as strong. Izuku had found lightning in a bottle, and they wouldn't be able to remake it, so Izuku was the only person who could keep an eye on what was going on inside all for one circles. Something they undoubtedly needed, but Nezu couldn't find his usual comfort from these facts. Nezu wished that he could give Izuku just one person he could rely on while Izuku was doing this, but there wasn't anyone they could send in that wouldn't screw everything up and lose it all. The few people in the know would frankly react far too much, and try to overcorrect the situation with a few key exceptions, but those people still wouldn't be able to add much more than their 2 cents to the situation at hand. Nezu's ears drooped, and he climbed up onto his desk so that he could be within arm's reach of the gash Izuku put in his desk. 2 weeks, and not even 2 full weeks, Izuku had taken over a place in his life that would be completely impossible for anyone else to ever replace. Who else would he talk with, fully assured that the other person wouldn't look at him as less than, or that he was only a mammal-like parrot? Nezu didn't even need a quirk to know the answer. No one would. Not his students he taught himself. Not the people he had worked with for 15 years. Not even Aizawa, who hid in his office and who saw him as an equal and respected him as a person, would be able to fully separate him from the fact he was an animal and connect with him on the same level Izuku had. This line of thought brought him to let out a sad series of chuffs. Nezu had always wondered if his emotions and instincts could overcome his quirk, and while his passing affection for the students he took under his wing was a sign, it wasn't enough and could just be happenstance. The urge to protect the young was the strongest out there, and no creature on Earth didn't have it, and regularly overcame the insurmountable instinct to protect yourself. But Izuku wasn't one of his students. Yes, he was young, but Izuku wasn't a child in his eyes, so this longing to protect the boy didn't stem from that instinct. If anything, Nezu saw Izuku as a packmate, despite the fact that stoats like himself didn't live in packs or groups of any kind. Reeling himself in, Nezu took a deep breath, then returned to his chair and wrote a text to Izuku asking him if he could possibly meet up with him today, and apologizing for asking this on a Sunday, since he knew that Izuku spent the day at home with his mother. His text had been left unread for most of the day, something he understood, and Nezu resigned himself to having the conversation tomorrow instead and went back to his work, mainly so he could have more time to speak with Izuku the next day. But when the sun set, he got a reply from Izuku, one asking if he'd mind Kurogiri portal him straight over to his office. Nezu quickly answered that it was absolutely fine and gave the coordinates for his office. Seconds later, a portal opened up in his office, and Izuku entered in a set of pajamas, apologizes Nezu. However, I doubt this will be a quick meeting, and I don't want my mom to know about this. So I hope you can forgive my state of dress, Izuku said as he sat down. It's fine, Izuku, Nezu assured, quickly racing over to the other couch and sat across from the boy. So you wanted to discuss the all-for-one situation further? Izuku inquired, and Nezu chirped with agreement. Yes, I understand that there isn't much I can do to help you with your plans, but I could do this, Nezu said, placing a few documents on the table. Izuku raised an eyebrow, but took them and began reading them, only to pause as he looked puzzled, and Nezu took it upon himself to explain it. It's a deep-cover civilian contract. Occasionally, the loved ones of villains and other criminals will come to a hero offering information. This is a contract that will grant them immunity to gather more information and aid the case, even if it means to do some illegal acts. Nezu told him. It wouldn't be surprising if Izuku didn't know about it, since contracts like this weren't used often, and the few who were willing to go undercover were sent to witness protection after their time undercover was up. If you sign this contract with me, I can give you a blanket of safety when this whole situation comes to light and keep them from arresting you as you were working under my direction in order to take down a dangerous villain, even if that means you must use lethal force, Nezu further added. Izuku remained silent as he kept reading, likely to double-check the wording was correct. He wasn't offended since he himself had painstakingly went over each word and the laws that applied so that Izuku would have full protection. After a few minutes, Izuku took out a pen and he signed the place where he was supposed on the contract before he passed it back to him. Thank you, Nezu, Izuku muttered. Of course, Izuku. You are taking a big risk for all of us. The least we could do is make sure you don't burn for it. Nezu responded and signed the contract as well, fully understanding that Izuku had given him a great deal of trust by signing this contract. Because Izuku was essentially trusting that he wasn't going to screw him later, and that Nezu would be going to face the consequences of Izuku's actions. On another note, would you be willing to meet with those involved with the current holder of inheritance? I understand this must be kept from spreading to many people, but I think we should at least inform them of the current situation, Nezu questioned. Izuku frowned at that and leaned back, crossing his arms. I don't know, Izuku replied, clearly very hesitant about this. Not that Nezu could blame him. If you don't want me to, then I will accept that and not say anything to them. It will cause problems, but ensuring your safety is far more important. Nezu assured with a series of chirps. Izuku leaned forward and sighed, one hand covering his eyes. Who all is involved? Izuku asked. I'm sure you know the current holder is All Might. His former sidekick Sir Nightai was made aware due to his quirk. Detective Tsukauchi is also aware of this because of his quirk, Recovery Girl, and the only other person is the friend of the previous holder and All Might's mentor, a retired hero, Gran Torino. Nezu listed off. Izuku hummed, I see. I already knew that Tsukauchi would know given his connection to All Might, but I would like to take some time to think about bringing them into the fold. Izuku answered. Nezu chirped, that's all I ask, Izuku. Nezu said, that should be all we need to discuss. Thank you for coming to meet me today, Izuku. Nezu told him. Izuku nodded before texting someone, likely Kirojiri, since the portal opened after a few more seconds, and Izuku left. Nezu turned his gaze back to the contract and went on to put it in his personal safe after making 5+ copies so that he could hide the other ones in case the original was somehow destroyed by accident. Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at U.A. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Bloomerbill for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on fanfiction.net for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.